Hi, I'm Franco Romero. I am a clairvoyant, author, near-death experiencer, and speaker and teacher.
What is the soul?
So what is the soul? Most people believe that the soul is something that they have to look for within themselves or somewhere. But actually, the soul is consciousness. Simply put, it's just consciousness. It's an intelligence. And so if you really want to know what the soul is, you just simply have to look at yourself in the mirror and see that the soul is who you are in terms of the, let's call it the thinker in the process of experiencing your life. But that's basically what the soul is.
Is a soul born? Does a soul die?
So a lot of people ask that question in terms of where does the soul come from? It is actually a creation process, but probably not something they're most accustomed to hearing. The way that I've been shown about the soul is that it's created through this evolutionary process of energy. When it becomes aware of itself, it becomes consciousness. And so kind of think of it as like this big pool of energy. And it just forms out of that because as energy starts to become aware of itself, it actually becomes consciousness and therefore it becomes a soul. It takes a little bit of time to get there, but eventually it's the soul that we recognize as who we are in this sort of 3D world.
What's the difference between a young soul and an old soul?
This one often creates a lot of misunderstanding. A lot of times people believe that an old soul or a young soul has something to do with how many lives that they actually have lived on this planet. But in actuality, though that might be somewhat to the truth, there's another piece that most people aren't aware of. An older soul happens to be one that has evolved already in their evolution of, say, let's say, their consciousness. So they've lived many lives outside of this world. And so they come here, and those tend to be the ones that are more often assisting humanity through what's called their awakening, rather than experiencing the awakening themselves. That's usually the way I view an old soul versus a young soul. The younger soul is typically the one that's actually experiencing this whole game that we call our reality here on Earth.
What is the soul's relation to Source/God?
Okay, so the relationship that we have with this thing called God or Source is also a point of debate as well. Because in the way that I experienced it with my near-death experience, I was actually shown that the soul, or this thing we call the soul or the spirit, isn't actually created from this thing we call God or Source. It actually is the one that does the creating. In other words, these souls come together as beings, very advanced beings, and they collectively create what we know of as God or Source. So it's really the other way around. And what's really important about that is that it gives us the ability to see just how powerful we are. When we come together, we create something so unique, so powerful, that we interpret it as God.
Mind, body, or soul? Which is the real us?
In this 3D reality that we're living in, we have this feeling that the body is actually the true representation of who we are. But really, it's not. It's as much, let's just call it an illusion, as everything else around us. What we truly are is the consciousness, which we often refer to as the mind and the soul, which is just another aspect of consciousness. It's the bigger aspect of consciousness that knows who we truly are outside of the body. That's really who we are. It's not really the body. The body's just a reflection of who we are as consciousness.
Are human incarnations voluntarily chosen?
Absolutely. This whole question about whether or not we had a choice to come down here, did we get forced down here, are we forced to even stay here? Everything is about free will. And so there is no such thing as a soul coming down here against their will. We all choose to come here. And in fact, this is such an incredible time in human history that you can't even imagine how much interest there is everywhere to participate in this. This is the hottest ticket in the entire universe. So everybody is trying to actually be part of this incredible thing we're calling the awakening.
What's the purpose of life on the physical plane?
So oftentimes I get the question, what is my purpose here? What is this all about? And this one's a little bit harder to understand, not understand, but cope with, because I often tell people that what we're truly here to do is just to remember. That's it. And the thing is, what are we trying to remember? We're trying to remember that we are all God and that we're just playing this incredible simulation we call life. And that the whole trick is, can we master the ability to come out of this 3D reality and remember who we are so that we could, at the end of all this, play in this game and master it to the point of creating magic and let's just call it mysticism, but it's all just a fun game. And this is sometimes hard for people to realize because of all the turmoil that's going on in their lives and in the world.
Why would a soul choose to leave heaven?
As much as heaven is this incredible utopic place that a lot of people have had near-death experiences talk about, there is ultimately this desire, as all of us, as consciousness, as God, as source, whatever you want to call it, to continue to expand. And to do that, we need to challenge ourselves, if you will, or create opportunities to experience something different in order for us to evolve, in order for us to grow our imagination, because imagination is a powerful tool for creation, but you can't use it if you're not really referencing it up against something. So in this world, for instance, it's all about contrast. And so this is something that in heaven we don't experience. And to really appreciate what we have when we say go back to heaven, we do these kind of schools to understand what other concepts of like contrast are so that we can come back and appreciate what we have when we are all of it. So this isn't something of a torturous process. This is actually something that we desire to do, to expand, to grow, to experience something we haven't done before as God. It's a constant creation process of evolution that we go through as consciousness.
Many people experience challenges while living in a body. Does the soul seek such challenges? And if so, why?
The soul, meaning us, is constantly searching, seeking ways in which to re-experience itself or experience itself in new ways. So this idea that we came here to suffer through these challenges, though they look that way for us here in 3D, are actually very growing experiences for the soul. This idea of contrast and understanding how the soul operates through this game of 3D is the biggest challenge we have. You see, a lot of us, because we identify ourselves with, say, like the body, we have a hard time seeing this reality from the perspective of us as higher consciousness or souls. But if we could, we'd see that all of these challenges are like really cool type of opportunities for us to see ourselves or to question ourselves, so that in the process of questioning ourselves in terms of our existence here, who we are, we start to remember that remembering piece of who we are as a supreme being. All of these challenges, whether they're traumatic or not or what have you, they're all opportunities for us to kind of see ourselves in the mirror and slowly but surely wake up to who we are and start asking the questions, is this really what it's all about? Because most of us are now realizing it's not.
Do souls have more than one incarnation, either on Earth or elsewhere?
This is probably one of the most incredible things that we're going to experience through this awakening process, which is to say, we're going to start to remember that we actually have a larger soul component. So we are actually experiencing ourselves in so many different ways, not just on this planet, not just on this plane, but we're also experiencing ourselves in what we call parallel realities. And here's the thing, we're not even experiencing the same life. We could be experiencing ourselves as in the form of other people. So we are incarnating in so many different ways. And the fundamental reason for it, at least right now, is because since this whole awakening process is part of sort of an end to a different type of paradigm here on Earth, and something that will send us into another higher dimension, we actually are getting chances to experience so many different lives for one purpose, so that if one of our incarnations can remember, it is a domino effect, and everybody gets to come along for the ride. We have so many different ways to get this right. That's why we incarnate so many times.
Does the soul plan its incarnations ahead of time?
So there is a process that we as spiritual beings go through when we choose to come here. And so there's some planning, but oftentimes people get confused that that means that everything is sort of predestined. Kind of think of it, it's this way. Imagine that you're just getting kind of an outline of what it is that you desire to experience in this life. And you're given that outline sort of as a curriculum or a syllabus, if you will, like in the school course. You get to choose how you play that outline out when you get here. So there's really no true predestined thing, but yes, we do have what we call lesson plans or things of that nature that we do sort of try to outline before we get here. But after that, everything else is really up to us in terms of what we want to do with it as we go forward here in this 3D game. So this outline or blueprint, if you want to call it that, does have some sort of sketching of what it is that we decide we want to sort of step into. So sometimes I get asked, to what extent do we determine who we come into with, like our parents, our families, and most of that is predetermined. Now, what isn't quite predetermined is, for instance, what those relationships might be. We might have, some people would call like lessons that we have to go through. And so by and large, the people that come in, that come in to say play the role as your parents, they have an idea of sort of the lesson that you're supposed to be experiencing here. Now keep in mind, nobody necessarily consciously knows that they're doing this, but when we are laying this all out, we sort of come together and figure out, if you will, who's playing what role. But yeah, certain things like parents, where you're going to live, to some extent, the path you might take in terms of a career. And I say to some extent because there are multiple ways to achieve whatever it is that you desire to do in this life by simply deviations, if you will, of the outline. And also keep in mind something. If, for instance, you really, really desire to have multiple outcomes or multiple careers or different types of parents or what have you, that's why you're getting the opportunity to incarnate in many different realities so that you can kind of play around with the people and the circumstances that you want to experience in this life.
Do we have soul groups that we incarnate with across different lifetimes?
So this question about soul groups is a really broad one, but I'm going to try to kind of simplify it for now. We actually, before we come here, we actually, in this blueprint or outline that we design, it's like a play, like a theatrical play. We actually come together as soul groups, and soul groups in the spiritual realm, the way that I've seen them, are actually families. It's like close spiritual entities that you have experienced so many different lifetimes with. And not just here on this planet, but in so many other places. And so there's this familiarity we have with each other. And we literally sit around and we kind of go, who is going to play this role? Because there's going to always have to be an antagonist and somebody else, and who are you going to fall in love with? The soul group sits around and does this. Now, Now, not everyone that comes into your life is part of your soul group, but by and large, the majority of the most important people in your life wind up being part of the soul group that you have actually experienced many, 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 many lives. Again, not just here, but in other schools all over the universe, and for that matter, all over the multidimensional realms.
Are there contracts or agreements between souls?
Contracts and agreements is something that you're going to hear a lot of people talking about it in different ways. But here again, my experience when I had my NDE, and also through a number of different channeling experiences that I've had, it kind of looks at this a little bit differently. Yes, there is sort of somewhat of an unwritten agreement, some sort of an unwritten contract that we're here to experience certain things in our lifetimes. Now keep in mind, the experiencing that we're trying to do now is to remember. So most of the people, let's say most of the beings that are here supporting your remembering, your awakening, are here to do that specific thing. They may play different roles, and they do have arrangements. Here's the really cool thing, is that you may have an arrangement with somebody that they play a certain role in this life for you, and they do their best to achieve that. But you also have an agreement with them. And the agreement with them is that in another reality, which is why I talk a lot about parallel realities, in another reality where they are the key players, you are playing a role for them. So, and it may not even be the same role that you guys are playing in your life. It makes the game extraordinarily fascinating because everybody is doing different things for each other. But as far as agreements and contracts go, there's just a general sense of what we're trying to accomplish, but it's always focused on the main player, which is typically us, you, me, whatever. It's not usually us, it's usually you as the main player.
Do spirit guides or angels assist us?
Spirit guides, angels, guardians, there's so many different names for them, but typically the general idea is that these are higher, more advanced spiritually, what I mean by spiritually consciousnessly, beings who have chosen to come here and not incarnate in a physical way to support your evolution, whatever that evolution may be. Again, in this particular time, it's the evolution of remembering, but they're here to guide you. And so a lot of people often believe or assume that they're so involved in your life that they actually sort of nudge you in a different direction or make even very, very sort of strict or defined sort of directional views of what you're supposed to do with your life. That's actually not the way that I've been shown. Most guides are there to do just what they are. They're guides. They sort of help you to make sure that you don't fall off sort of the rails or don't hit the bumpers too much of life, because we have a tendency to sort of go off script sometimes, and the guides are there to just kind of nudge you back into that path, whatever that path is, whatever that growth opportunity is. But oftentimes they get misunderstood as like being more directly involved with that. But that's typically what a guide would do, is just to be there, to be an ear, to sort of give you a sort of an energetic nudge, to kind of give you affirmation that you're on the right path, or maybe not. So now I often get the question, so what does this look like? And here again, there's this common belief among many that they have to look for this somewhere out here, like with signs. And though those things do exist, you know, maybe you see a specific bird or something that always kind of affiliated with in your life with something that meant something positive or negative. You might see various people or things that sort of maybe a reminder of something. A song comes on that that reminds you of a specific time with a specific lesson or a specific person. Those things happen a lot. Okay, those will actually happen more and more. But here's the thing. What people really could benefit more from with their guides is if they listen to the voice within themselves. Because what people don't realize is that this inner voice, this gut feeling, this thing called the intuition, these are the ways in which your guides really try to communicate with you right away, like directly. But oftentimes we discard them and we look away. We kind of go, the most common thing that I always hear is that people will say, "Oh, that was just my imagination. I must be crazy." But no, it is your imagination, because that's the way they connect with you. Listen to your voices, listen to your thoughts, listen to your intuition, your gut feelings, because your guides will usually try to communicate with you now more than ever that way. That's the beginning of how we all start to create our clairvoyant abilities. So don't shut it down.
What is death?
Well, this one, death, the topic of death, is often given such a 3D interpretation, meaning sort of a more body type of, more sort of physical interpretation. We look at it as the death of the body. And remember that in this sort of world, this illusion that we're in, we associate everything with our bodies. And we're not the body. We're consciousness, the consciousness that plays the game of the body. So from that standpoint, and just from listening to other near-death experiencers, that we realize that there is no real death here. You've heard this before, and some people may not have, but it's a continuation. This is just a continuation. This is truly in the spiritual realms, what we would call heaven and beyond. This is really just a blink of an eye. It doesn't feel that way to us, but it's just a blink of an eye. And when it's over physically, then we move on to other games and other experiences. The consciousness does. The body may stay here, but the consciousness moves on. And by the way, as long as we're on the subject, there is this belief that the body has to die physically. But in the years to come, there are many now that are seeing sort of from premonitions and channeling and near-death experiences that are telling us that we're coming to an age where the body, the physical body, will no longer experience death. And we're not talking about 100 years from now. We're talking about as early as within the next decade, if not sooner than that, which is incredibly hard for us to fathom. But there's already enough evidence, enough science behind the fact that the body does not have to age the way that we have been told. It can actually grow young. We may never physically die again.
After death, do souls return to visit loved ones still on Earth?
Souls, when one dies physically, they, let's just call it ascend into a space that we often refer to as heaven. In the way that I've been shown, heaven isn't as much a place as it is a stream of higher frequencies of consciousness. But no matter how you look at it, souls can come back and visit this plane. But typically they don't choose to come back unless there is some desire by those that are here still to sort of bring them back for some type of guidance or reassurance. Because once the soul leaves and they realize that this part of their experience is over and they get to go back to this thing we call heaven, this utopic state of consciousness, it's difficult for them to want to come back. It's not difficult, but there's no desire. And here's another kind of head-twisting thing, and probably something that would have to have more discussion on. But I always tell people that when one dies physically and crosses over, the people that are waiting for them to greet them are the same people that they just left behind. And so there's really no reason for them to desire to come back into the game, into the illusion of where they just came from. So when they do come back, it often has to do with people who are looking to sort of put closure to the death of somebody that meant so much to them. So they have the ability to come back, and oftentimes it happens. For most of us, it happens in these subtle signs. Things that they were typically known to do or like, or maybe there was like maybe an animal or a creature that they often got associated with, or a butterfly or something. Just any kind of subtle reminder that they haven't left that person completely. They've moved on, but there's still an essence, an energy essence of them always with them. Oftentimes, especially now as we start to evolve as a planet consciousnessly, I'm hearing more that people, and this isn't necessarily new, but people are starting to come back and revisit through deep dreams, through visions, through even telepathic thought waves, because as we continue to evolve consciousnessly, we're enhancing our ability to communicate with them more directly. It used to be that we'd have to go to others to do that, but as we evolve in consciousness, one of the first things that we're going to be able to do, and are starting to do, is to have direct communication. You can feel them. It senses. We can sense they're there with maybe the way our body sort of gets a little cold, or maybe there's your hair sort of stands on end, or something like that. But oftentimes it's even more direct than that, and it usually tends to be through dreams and visions. So they're always there to provide comfort. They don't desire to move on completely until they know that for sure, you're moving on as well.
What is the veil of forgetting, and why do we need it?
The veil of forgetting is this mechanism, if you will. It's something that we chose to experience before we came here. And the way I describe it is that we literally turn all the knobs off of almost every ability we have as spiritual beings to play in any kind of game like this. We forget, and that's the big one, we forget most of who we are. It's literally like we've shut all of the programming down so that we can forget and experience ourselves in this 3D earthly body and go through the experiences, because if we did know enough, it would basically end this experience pretty quickly, because again, we're here to experience contrast. And so we really have to come at this with an understanding that we are not who we are, so that we can find our way back to this big awareness that we are God. So oftentimes I get this question of, so that seems pretty silly. Why would we come here to forget only to remember? And though that seems like a very sensible question to ask, just kind of look at it from not the 3D you, but look at it from where you're coming from. If, say, for instance, we knew who we were right away, we wouldn't have the same type of experience with this school that's been specifically made for us to experience contrast. In other words, we would know that fear wasn't fear, and we wouldn't allow ourselves to imagine greater opportunities of new worlds that could come out of that fear, out of the things that have sort of held us back here. Because keep in mind something, the idea here is to use our imagination, our creativity, to create all sorts of new outcomes as a result of something that we never have experienced before, which in this case, for most of us is, well, for all of us, it's fear. This is something that doesn't exist in the higher levels of what we would call sort of the spirit world or heaven or whatever you want to call it. To forget enables us to expand our creative minds into realms that we've never dealt with before. And so that's why we experience the forgetfulness. The idea is this: if you can go so deep into sort of the rabbit hole and forget entirely who you are, and still manage to find your way through by also creating new sort of concepts of worlds as God, that is the true mastery of this game. If you can take that awareness when you didn't even understand who you were and find your greatness, then you could take this thing we call fear to other dimensions when we are aware of what it can do. And instead of making it into a villain, we make it into a companion, something that we can create whole entire new worlds with. Again, it's just a matter of perspective. If you're looking at it from 3D, it looks ridiculous. But if you're looking at it from 5D and beyond, it looks like one of the most exciting opportunities to redevelop, redefine ourselves as God.
Discuss the role of free will in a given incarnation.
The question of free will. It's probably one of the most confusing topics that you'll hear. But this is the way that I have sort of been given in terms of how to look at it. Free will is really quite simple, and it has to do with how you perceive how you are existing at any moment in your life. The biggest free will that you have is the ability to be aware that you are in every moment of your life faced with a decision of how you want to proceed. And to be more specific, do you want to react to life in a way that often, if not always, makes you the victim? Or do you want to create? And in doing the latter, choose to be the creator. Choose to start recognizing yourself as God. That is the true essence of free will that any soul has in this particular lifetime.
Is life on the physical plane an illusion?
One of the greatest discoveries or remembrances that we're going to have, both individually and as a human race, is this whole idea of whether or not this is an illusion or not. Now, the great thing about that is that right now, there is plenty of evidence pointing to that. That's not to say it's going to be an easy concept to sort of sink in, because the idea that we might be in some way, shape, or form part of a simulation raises so many questions about whether we're real or not. Remember, it isn't about the reality of our bodies or this whole thing, this whole construct. It's about the consciousness. If you can just remove yourself from thinking of yourself as sort of the body, then it's a little bit easier for you to sort of imagine yourself being, sort of a virtual reality game, the kind that everybody plays, where you have the remotes and you're sitting on a couch somewhere and you're playing the role of an avatar. If you could do that and see yourself as God or consciousness playing a game in a simulation, it makes it a lot easier. So therefore, if the question is this a reality or simulation or some kind of game? The answer is, it's a game, it's a simulation. And we're going to realize this in the coming years, not that far down the road. So one of the biggest questions that often gets brought up is, so are we in some way, shape, or form being forced into this reality? And the answer is no. Keep in mind something that we don't really quite understand yet or have kind of fully embraced. When I am shown what we are as God or as consciousness or say source, the thing that comes through is that we have a childlike essence in this spiritual thing we call God, source, or creator. Now, if you could just see it for that, for now, you can understand how, as a child, we love playing games. We designed this game to enjoy it, to find the joy out of it. That's the main reason why we created this game, other than to remember, is that whole joy of what happens when you do remember what it is that you're doing or who you are. So there is no sense of this being a prison or any of that, or somehow we were tossed in here. This is by choice something we decided to do, to experience, just like we would play a game, to experience the fun of playing these digital virtual reality games. This just happens to be the greatest one ever created.
Do we create our own realities?
So with this idea that this is all a series of programs, the question is, how does these programs get created, or how do we play with them? What's our role with them? And this gets into things like the law of attraction. But what people don't really understand is that there's a little bit more to it than maybe the way that, for those who have kind of explored it, actually delve into this. The idea is that our thoughts and our emotions create this vibration called feelings. And if you look at this again as a virtual reality kind of programming kind of scenario, our feelings are the actual language by which we create programs by. So the way that we influence this reality is basically by how we perceive it and use it to create thoughts and combine it with emotions to create a feeling. You combine these three things and you shoot them out, emote them out into the universe, and you are literally communicating with the game. You're communicating with this broader thing we call consciousness, or the higher, what we call higher self. It's a constant back and forth communication between you as the creator and the creation that you built called the game. You're constantly feeding it new programs with your thoughts, your emotions, and what you exude with your feelings, which is the language of the programs that are used for the game.
Describe the life between lives.
The in-between lives that we live, where we go in between the incarnated lives, is extraordinarily immense when you start to look at yourself as a divine being. You exist in other dimensions, in other universes, in realms beyond even what we call heaven. It's an extraordinary experience. This too will become part of our remembrance. And when we realize this, we will understand the magnitude by which we are truly supreme beings.
Are we judged or punished for our mistakes in the afterlife?
How this kind of plays out here in the 3D world is that oftentimes, not oftentimes, always, we do a fair amount of judging of ourselves here. And so what I tell people is that if there is this kind of judgment of guilt and other things that you go through in life because of the way that you have behaved towards others or yourself, it's typically done here because this is the way that sort of the game has been sort of set up for you to work through those things here and find the grace to remember that this is just an experience you're going through to help you grow spiritually. Because by the time you pass on, even if you're not aware of that before you actually leave this plane, by the time you go into the other realm, this heaven realm, if you will, everything that's done there is typically to help further your growth so that in another lifetime, you're not necessarily experiencing this type of pain and feeling of guilt and remorse for the things that you've done. You've enhanced your consciousness to a point where you've moved on from that lesson, if you will.
Is there such a thing as hell?
So another thing that typically comes through for a lot of people is at this point when they're questioning all sorts of things about the reality, is there a hell? And I jokingly say, but not really, you can't get any worse than this. This, in a sense, is sort of the most contrast of the most contrast that you're going to experience. Now, obviously, there are people who say there are, but this is the way that I've been shown. And this is to say this. Hell would be a place where there would be an extraordinary amount of negative energy that would have to be applied to the creation of hell and all of, say, the beings that run hell, including what others would call like Satan or Lucifer or whatever it is. To do that, it is absolutely impossible to have a space called hell, because that would imply that those individuals would have a superior sense of consciousness. In the way that the universal spirit world works, those consciousness levels have to be extraordinarily pure to achieve that type of superiority. It doesn't make sense that something this huge called hell could exist with such powerful creatures of beings with that kind of superiority, because even from a simple physics standpoint, that kind of energy cannot exist in the higher levels of frequency. So just from that standpoint, no, there is no such thing as hell.
Describe the life review.
The life review is a process of evolution. In other words, it's a place where we as souls or spirits will go to review not just our lives, but the way in which we impacted the lives of others who were in our experience. It's a way to fully appreciate the full impact of what we have done, both good and let's call it bad actions on our part. It's a broader sort of review of everything. It's not just necessarily on how we might have hurt somebody, but how we also, on the opposite end, how we also made people happy and joyous in ways that we oftentimes didn't even know we did. Just the subtlest things that we did in our lives. We don't give ourselves credit for those things. When we look at life reviews, we always assume it's always the things that we did wrong. But most of the life reviews happen to be about all the amazing things that we did, let's say, right, not just in our existence in this 3D world, but how it impacted other people's lives. And for that matter, the whole scheme of the universe gets impacted when those kind of things happen as well.
What is karma?
One of the things that we will experience here very soon is the power of our empathic skills to not just absorb other people's sort of pain or bring forth our own pain from past lineages, but we'll also understand that whether it's karma or whether it's empathy, that we know or we can have the ability as a divine being, as God, to be able to switch that energy around, and rather than give back to people karma, which is often referred to as something more negative, but we can recycle it and know how to use that energy to create what I refer to as compassion, the ability to see and experience that same situation as extraordinarily perfect. Perfect in that it was exactly designed so that it had some kind of impact on you as well as others, so that you can help remember who you are. Again, depending on the level, the perspective you're looking at, if it's 3D, karma is usually something we don't understand, and it tends to have some negative implications of past life experiences. Whereas what we have soon to find out is that it's part of our empathic ability to change energy from what we would consider to be negative to an extraordinarily positive experience in our lives.
How do you define forgiveness?
Okay, so forgiveness. Another extraordinarily misunderstood concept, and for rightful reasons, because we've been sort of conditioned to believe that there is this necessity to forgive. And I'm not going to say that this isn't a bad thing, but if there is forgiveness, it's really what I would call giving. Forgiveness is giving ourselves the grace by which to let go of the things that we have, let's say, quote unquote, done wrong in our lives, because that's not the way that this game works. If you understand that every moment stands by itself, and therefore it's really your choice to make a change in the way that you perceive yourself and the way that you have also been sort of emoting yourself to others, and to just give yourself the grace to let it go, that's the greatest form, I guess, of forgiveness you can have. But in the spiritual realms, there is no such thing as forgiveness. It's just a 3D concept that we use just to, typically to expect others to do it for us, but not necessarily to do it for ourselves. Forgiveness is just the act of giving yourself grace so you can move on.
How do you define happiness?
So this Earth School has been created specifically, this whole experience has been created specifically for the intent of experience happiness or joy. it often gets overlooked because we're in such a desire or quest to find love that we don't realize that everything we do here is for the purposes of experiencing happiness or joy. So to me, happiness is when we realize that we have come to a full realization of who we truly are and are allowed to, when I say that, I mean who we truly are as divine, childlike beings that are free to express ourselves in the manner that we know ourselves to be, and to do it in a way where we can feel this sense of love, purpose, freedom, peace in doing it. And those are the definitions of self-realization or the awakening process itself.
Discuss the idea of oneness/unity and how we can apply it in our everyday lives.
One of the things that we're going to experience here really, really soon is that this idea of oneness and unity isn't just a concept. It's going to be an experience, something that we truly will actually integrate ourselves with others, and as if we're almost experiencing their life. So we won't need that sort of review process after this life because we'll be experiencing it in real time. But the question is, how do we actually do this now? And the easiest way that I tell people to do it is in the process of this whole idea of karma, empathy. Instead of looking at somebody's actions or your actions because of somebody's actions that are harmful, let's just say, and treating them that way, reciprocating it that way, look at everything from the lens of compassion. Because when you can see compassion in everybody, you're seeing it in yourself. And what you're seeing in terms of compassion is their perfection as spiritual beings. The fact that they're here experiencing this life so that you can remember who you are is a true act of not only compassion, but of perfection in terms of what they are to you as your teacher. So that's the way that I always try to tell people, look at everything through the eyes of compassion, and you will see the perfection in what you're doing, not only in your life, but what they're doing for you in their life.
What does the belief in separation cost us?
Separation is one of the main reasons why we came to experience this reality. It goes hand in hand with this whole idea that this is all a school of contrast and duality. We don't have this type of an experience as spiritual beings. Everything we do in the world, in the realms outside of this earth school is about oneness. So we experience here things that we don't experience there, and that gives us an opportunity to see what life would be like if we weren't connected to each other, if we didn't have the sense of feeling and knowing what others were going through in their quest to grow. And so in this 3D world, the act of separation has caused us to believe that it's a survival of the fittest type of mentality, where the way that we get through this life is by basically stepping over others in order to get to some sort of attainable goal that somebody else has told us we need to achieve. And we don't realize that those goals can't really mean much to us unless we do it together. But separation allows us to see basically what happens when we don't feel into each other as one. Separation, we never feel those pains or sufferings. We learn to basically grow without them, which means that we neglect the others in our way to sort of self-enlightenment.
Where is heaven?
So this concept of heaven and what makes it so unique and beautiful, despite what we've been sort of taught about heaven, is that it's a very magical place. It truly brings magic to life because in the state of consciousness we can create. We become the true fashions of ourselves as creators. We literally can experience anything we desire that we have come to understand through this earth school experience. And that's again why we do this experience, is because we create new desires, and those desires create new worlds. And heaven allows us to do that because the frequencies that we go to in getting into a state of, say, heaven on earth allows us to play with energy as if it were just like clay, where we can mold it into anything that we want it to be just by the virtue of using our consciousness mind. So our desire for heaven always seems to be well, not our desire, but it always seems like we achieve only heaven when we leave our bodies. But the whole point of this Earth School is to, right now, is to experience that experience now in this physical form.
Where is God?
The whole idea of this school revolves around our inability to access God. We don't know what that really means, even connecting to it, because we've been led to believe that whatever this thing we call God is, doesn't exist here. It's far away, and we have no real sense of knowing how to get there. But what I tell everyone is that God is you. If you desire to know what God is, look at yourself in the mirror. That is the purest definition of God. We are God. We're just playing this game of forgetfulness, but God is us. Consciously, we are God, trying to remember ourselves in this extraordinary game of remembering.
Many believe we're shifting to a higher consciousness on this planet. Do you agree? And if so, can you describe this shift?
Absolutely, this is the time. So for thousands of years, we have been looking to the skies for something to happen miraculously that would shift this whole reality into something more utopic. And what we have come to realize, or slowly coming to realize, that the only thing that we were waiting for to happen was we were waiting for ourselves to start remembering. Once we started to remember, and this will start to become very global here very soon, once we start to remember who we are and what we're capable of doing, not as human beings, but as spiritual beings playing the role or a game of being a human, we're going to be able to create a magnificent life in a world of experiences that we have only dreamt about up until now. The shift that is happening is enabling us to do that, to remember. And in the process, not only are we remembering who we are, but we're actually remembering how to use our abilities as God to manifest things that we only at one time could only dream of. But this is what the shift is going to do over the next couple of years. This is something that's happening right now, and everything that we have always been told of what this world would look like is going to manifest itself in the next several years.
What's the most important thing you learned from your near-death or other spiritually transformative experience?
The greatest remembrance that I have of my NDE was this idea that this thing called heaven can only be achieved through death, a physical death. And that this thing we've known to become God or creator or oneness or source, somehow the way we were taught was that it sort of created us in some way, and in the process we disconnected from it. But on the contrary, not only are we so extraordinarily connected to it, my experience was that the oneness, this thing we call God or source, was actually created by us. We are the creators of the wholeness of what we call God. And therefore, by definition, we are God.
What are some practical applications of the idea that we're eternal spiritual beings?
One of the greatest practical ways in which to start experiencing yourself in your divinity is by understanding that every moment that you exist, I'm not saying every second, but every moment, which is an even smaller unit of time, is independent of each other. And if you could just have the awareness to know that every moment is uniquely different from the previous moment and the one coming up, you know that regardless of what your decisions are, and if you feel like you've made the wrong ones, you can right the ship by being aware that you have the controls to the entire game, by being present enough to know that you can switch at any moment from a negative environment or feeling to a positive one, and that shift will have seismic changes or differences or impacts on not only your life, but everybody's life, as long as you are aware that you're doing them.
What's the secret to remembering who we really are?
To remember yourself as terms of who you are is really a simple process. We make it out to be too difficult, too complex. But this is where imagination comes in. I always tell people, if you can't necessarily buy into everything you're hearing or feeling, even inwardly about yourself, imagination gives you the ability to just play with these concepts, to let yourself bridge the gap between who you have been told you are to who you truly are. And so if there's one thing I could tell people to do is to continue to nurture their imaginations and to grow big, have expectations of yourself that are way beyond what anyone has ever told you, because imagination is the key to remembering. And imagination links you to the highest elements of who you are as God. In this world, we've been told differently, that it doesn't matter if you use your imagination. Imagination is the strongest tool you have to remembering.
What does our soul want us to know?
So there's this whole idea that we have no relationship quite with our souls. But in actuality, our souls are our inner voice, our inner consciousness speaking to us. And really simple, at this point in the juncture of not just our own individual evolution, but in humanity's evolution, the soul wants us to know that we are divine beings, collectively coming together to experience this human existence. That the time of forgetfulness is done. It's now time to bring heaven on earth.
Is there a positive message or message of hope you'd like to leave us with?
We often get told from a young age that individually we have no relevance to the bigger picture. And I'm often reminded of Gandhi when I was a young kid, probably younger than I like to admit, that Gandhi had an expression, be the change you desire to see in the world. And it was often difficult for me to see how one individual could change that much of the world. Know that you, each one of us, has the ability through our changing of our consciousness awareness that we are just these insignificant little beings to knowing ourselves as God. We have the ability to seismically change not just our lives, but everybody's life. Find your truth and you will change the world.